Howdy everyone. A lot of people like capitalism, more specifically free market capitalism, and a lot of that is because people like working, and people like having their work pay off. People like capitalism, in short, because it's a meritocracy. Or is it? He asks comically at the start of a 15-minute video that implies that that's not the case. And before we start today, I want to very briefly highlight a fallacy that a lot of people fall into, and that's the just world fallacy. Its main principle is along the lines of, hey, I've been punished for being bad all my life, and I've been rewarded for being good all my life by my surroundings and upbringing, and as a result, I believe the whole world is nice to good people and mean to bad people. The world is fair and naturally restores moral justice. And this is an attitude commonly held by people who are cis, straight, white, male, and capitalist. And if you're angry now, it's because I correctly guessed 5 facts about you, or because I guessed 4 out of 5 and I was wrong about one of them. But don't fret, you're the exact person I made this video for. Now sit back and buckle up because this is going to be a wild ride. So first, let's look at what capitalism is and how it works. If we look at this tweet by not CIA PSYOP John, who replied with the same comment copied and pasted, no joke, 6 times, capitalism is when the workers own the means of production, and socialism is when the state owns the means of production. And I must say, I was absolutely willing to take him at his word, right up until he told me to Google the answer. So, I did that to double check to make sure he was correct, but that's not what Google said. Capitalism is defined by Google Dictionary simply as the means of production being owned by private owners for profit. Now, I hate mansplaining basic economics as much as the next person, but we need to explain a few of our terms. This might be a little bit wordy, but it's needed to properly understand the concept. If you understand these 3 phrases, then skip to this timestamp shown on the screen right now. The means of production is a Marxist dog whistle, and it refers to, broadly, the labour and all that encompasses that gets work done. This may range from tilling the ground of farmland, or even office work arranging a spreadsheet, for example. Anything that is done by humans or machines that creates something or adds value to something. Now, when I talk about value, I don't just mean price. I mean something slightly different. And to highlight this difference, here is an example. If you bake one cookie in London and another cookie in Honolulu, then you can probably sell them at different prices, but their value is fundamentally the same. It's the same amount of work for the same cookie. Value in this regard is kind of a more objective quality of worth to society, whereas price is the monetary value that tries to match that, but isn't wholly accurate because it changes according to a lot of other factors, such as supply and demand. Private owners usually just refers to non-governmental owners, usually corporations, but not necessarily always. Sometimes it's an individual person or group of people, for example. Some people, usually leftists, make a distinction between private property and personal property, but according to liberal biased source Wikipedia, that's something that is still up for debate, so I won't make that distinction between private and personal property in this video, though one certainly could. However, I will be talking about the final term that we'll define today, and that is the profit motive. And profit is a concept that most of us seem to understand. It's the concept that capitalism is predicated upon, and it refers broadly to receiving more than you gave. Another point to bring up is that free market capitalism generally justifies itself because competition helps keep prices as low as possible and make sure that companies aren't ripping you off. And while this isn't perfect, it generally does do a pretty good job of making sure that prices keep to acceptable levels compared to what went into them, provided, of course, that that competition does stay around, and this will become relevant later. So what I'm going to do for the first part of this video is talk about our current society and a few ways that this meritocracy isn't being obeyed, with large and considerable exploits to the system. And these are things that are caused by capitalism, but aren't necessarily inherent to its ideals, just some things that are anti-meritocracy that happen within our society that capitalism hasn't done anything to prevent. So with all that in mind, it's first important to recognize that no matter how much you believe about supply and demand, if you can do the exact same labor in one country as someone else in a different country, but make less than that person, then it is fundamentally not a meritocracy, and depends largely on where you decided to set up shop. And this might seem like a nitpick, but it highlights a larger point that I want to make. If the profit you make can be more proportional to things that are not the amount and quality of work that you do, in this case it's living in a smaller city or an island, for instance, then this doesn't bode very well for your economic system. Another problem that exists in this society that isn't necessarily intrinsic to capitalism, but more exacerbates the problems of it, is wealth inheritance. If you're born into a millionaire family, you're going to need to do a lot less work to become a millionaire than if you were penniless. Just wait for your parents or grandparents to die. And if your wealth correlates more to the wealth of your parents than the amount of work that you've done, that's also not meritocracy. But at the same time, this has a lot of effects on society if you go down enough generations, especially if some families have had dramatically less money over the years, often due to race, slavery, and societal ostracization, but that's a topic for another video. But again, this isn't necessarily directly a capitalism thing, but it's also not meritocracy, and it also exacerbates the effects of other issues, and they do tend to carry on from generation to generation. There are other examples as well. One such example is landlords. Imagine your job is to be a landlord, and you earn money from letting people live in buildings you own. So you have a tenant and they stay in the building for a year. They pay you rent for that year, they're good boys and leave it nice and tidy, and then they leave. At the end of it, you still have the house. You didn't do any work you wouldn't otherwise have done if you had just wanted to keep this house empty, but you also have an extra year's worth of rent for free. This is money that you didn't earn. And you might say this is earned because you worked hard to buy a house and therefore deserve to do what you want with it. But that avoids the problem of this being a money machine that doesn't cost work. And fundamentally, this goes against meritocracy as a concept. You might also say that the upkeep of the house and organising renting is actually work, and as a result you are doing work. But the kicker is, the owners of the house aren't necessary for that process. They can, and more often than not do, delegate that job to people who work those jobs professionally, property managers and estate agents and such, and instead they act as the middleman, siphoning off money that the people who actually do the work earned. Because let's face it, if you're going into landlording as a career, then you're not going to just charge people for exactly how much the real estate agents and the property managers' time is worth. You're going to charge as much as you can get away with. And this is often increased because since you're the provider for something everyone needs to survive, housing, you have much more leverage over the market than the market has over you. A more politically charged version of this is large corporations. Let's take McDonald's as an example. If you work as a crew member, as this website calls it, you likely work minimum wage, or thereabouts, for 8 hours a day or so. And according to this article, each McDonald's makes an average of $2.7 million a year in income. Let's imagine also that there are about 40 to 60 workers at each place. That's an average of $45,000 to $67,500 worth of work that each worker has contributed, assuming each worker puts in a consistent amount of work. And yet, the cashiers and crew members only make about $20,000 a year. So where is that money going? Well, that money gets funneled up the company and goes into the hands of people who didn't do your work. You're the one cranking the money machine for the board of directors. A common counter to this is that the work that the managers do is just worth more. This is, of course, not true. Each McDonald's could function perfectly fine without most of the people above them, and instead with just cashiers, employees, and a manager or two to keep everything in check. But McDonald's as a company would not be worth anything with just the investors, the board, and managers. Another argument that people make is that the massive amount of wealth isn't capital, it's all in shares, so it can't be redistributed. Mr. McDonald's can't just get rid of all his shares, cash them in, because then everybody would sell their stock, prices would reduce drastically, and then nobody has any money. Is that what you want, liberals? And I'm going to ignore the fact that companies could just redistribute some of those shares proportionally to each of their workers according to how valuable their work is worth, and that would mean workers get compensated more fairly. And I will instead insist that a better way of sorting out this inequality is as follows. If you're a fan of democracy, like I am, then you might be quite annoyed that McDonald's as a corporate structure doesn't really work as one. If you're under someone else, then they could fire you at any minute. They earn a portion of the wealth that you earned the company, as mentioned earlier, and you have to conform to their demands. An idea that would solve this problem is if you decided to make your business into a democracy, so that people who are actually more powerful within the business, the cashiers and the crew members, can vote to be fairly represented. Just an idea for you. I also think that it's important to tell you as well that that isn't how shares work. When someone buys out a company or a CEO gets fired or resigns, those shares go to someone else on the board. There is some sort of small shock in share price because of uncertainty due to how the business will function, but generally it goes back to normal when the process is finished. And in that instance, a large amount of shares changing hands doesn't really affect very much in the long run. Redistributing shares to the employees could easily work in mostly the same way, except the company would also work more for the interests of the employers and the interests of the customers. I could also make a point about how shares usually don't mean all that much on their own either, and we'll talk about investments in shares a bit later on in the video, but for now, imagine them as agreed compensation for an inconvenience. If your business stopped paying attention to them, the shareholders riding on a high would be a bit annoyed and probably sue you for all you have. But even then, the company's assets and everything that makes it up, workers, buildings, and the services they provide, all still exist regardless of the legal actions taken by the shareholders and stock market gurus. All is to say that the shareholders fundamentally aren't doing anything to markedly improve the value of anything to society, and as a result, they're not really doing any work. And yet they're still earning money from their stocks. Anti-meritocracy goes the other way too, after all. So that's all the things off the top of my head that I would say are anti-meritocratic in capitalism, but could at least be addressed by our current society in a way that still keeps capitalism around. However, in a minute, I'll talk about problems that are intrinsic to capitalism. That's right, we haven't even gone over the worst part. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about racism, and homophobia, transphobia, and ableism too, but racism is the most obviously prevalent and least deniable one. Topical for 2020, I know. But anyway, I didn't initially know where to put this in the video because there's a lot of discussion about racism or bigoted discrimination in general is caused by capitalism, or if capitalism just makes it worse. Personally, I'm of the belief that capitalism definitely has made it significantly worse. See redlining, war on drugs and for-profit prisons, lobbying to keep immigration illegal, reactionary politics online being easily marketable, financial crashes and racism, etc. And it definitely hampers the process that can be made to eliminate it for the most part, but to say that capitalism invented racism is just untrue. And getting rid of capitalism, if you wanted to do that hypothetically, is not going to solve this discrimination alone. Anyway, it's time to explain why capitalism is anti-meritocratic in its design, and to do that, we're going to have to look at gambling. Gambling is, to put it succinctly, giving to a system on the basis that it could return more. Whether that system be a betting agency, the lottery, or a prosperous startup company, they're all gambles all the same. And this isn't an instant money hack, purely because of the word could. There is risk involved. There is a possibility that your betting outcome could be wrong. You might not win the lottery. The startup company could just be a Ponzi scheme. What you're doing when you're gambling, essentially, is taking on that risk that maybe the money you put in just disappears into the ether, never to be seen again. But the question is, if you do win big, did you work for that money? If I came up to you and told you I was a multimillionaire and told you I won the lottery, you would say I didn't work for a penny of it. But if I told you I was an investor, then you wouldn't be so quick to make that judgment. But the premise is the same. I earned millions because I chose 6 random numbers on a Friday night isn't so different to I earned millions because I put money in a random company I had a gut feeling about. The scale is just magnified. And for the people who put in the same effort as you but didn't win, what about them? And this gambling isn't just intrinsic towards investors and shareholders, but it's also intrinsic to the concept of profit itself. If your business is something like a shop, then your unique selling product is buying from retailers in bulk on the assumption that you can sell enough of them to make a profit. And some shops won't do that and will have to go out of business. And sure, there are some outside factors that can somewhat be accounted for, like competition and location, but there's still an element of chance that rewards some companies more than others in a way that's extrinsic to the amount of work that they do. Finally, I want to talk about what this leads to. Because to all that you might just say, that's just gambling. That's how gambling works. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But if you're a winner, you end up with more money and a higher capability of gambling again. And if you're lucky then, you're going to be even better off, and the process continues. This isn't to do with making the right investments and rewarding foresight, which is questionably meritocratic at best anyway. It's sheer dumb luck. Because the same investors with good foresight and the same ideas can lose out as well. And if your gambles pay off consistently, you earn yourself a reputation. And if you have a reputation for having prosperous gambling habits, then you can earn a lot of leverage over the market. Because others are more likely to cave towards your demands much more heavily. So you get better and better deals because of course investments in your business make money. You're a world-renowned swag money boss businessman after all. you get progressively better and better deals on buying products, and other competitors just can't compete. They can't afford to buy in bulk, and they can't afford to sell at the ridiculously low prices that you can, and even if they can, you can just buy them out. And if you can hold on to a large portion of the market, you can name your price. All because you won a couple of bets. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough, you get 16-year-old anarcho-capitalists defending you in the comment sections of YouTubers who might hurt your feelings. Ultimately, the best way to look at capitalism is less of a survival of the fittest mentality, but more of a competition. And it's important to note that competitions have winners and competitions have losers. For every winner that makes a profit, there's 1,000 losers who make a loss. And the concept of profit dictates that, fundamentally, someone somewhere is getting a bad deal. And it's curious that it's rarely ever the billionaires who, rather than making stuff and adding value to things, instead own the things you need to survive. This video is the first video over 10 minutes that I've uploaded in a while, and partly because, in relation to most of the topics I choose to talk about, I end up having a lot less to say about it than I usually think. I also don't, currently, believe very much in fleshing out a video just to reach the 10-minute mark. Either way, I want to let you know that a large proportion of my viewers are not subscribed to me, and that means there's a good chance that you aren't subscribed, so go and check if you are, and comment to let me know that you like this video because I need that validation in my life. Be sure to follow my socials in the description for cool posts such as this one, and as always, have a good